Hello everyone, and welcome to the first class of the Secure Websites Masterclass. For today's first class, we are going to be more or less learning the basics of how secure websites actually work. We won't actually be getting into the actual demonstration as far as how to accomplish this quite yet. All of that will be covered in classes 2 through 4 of this series. The reasoning for that, though, is simply that for people that are not familiar with this whole process, it's important to kind of understand what exactly you're going to have to end up doing, what it's going to involve, learning some of the terminology that I will be referring to in this class. So we're kind of laying the foundations today for everything that will be coming in the future classes of this series. For this particular reason, this class will likely end up being the shorter of all 4 of the classes, seeing as how the next classes in this series will be actual live demonstrations as far as setting up an actual website, making it secure, going through all of the required steps to accomplish this. Now, there is a guidebook for this particular class, which you can find attached here. And this is something that will be continuing on for all of the classes in this series. This guidebook is kind of just a quick reference guide, something that you could use in the future if you just need to remember a particular topic instead of having to actually go through the entire video. All the classes in this series, though, will be recorded, and you will have access to all of those video recordings. So if you do ever want to go back and revisit anything that has been discussed or taught during this series, you will definitely be able to do so. With that said, I want to go ahead and dive into the training for today. Today's class will be purely slideshow based, whereas the other classes in this series will have a minor amount of slideshows just for your reference, but a good chunk of those remaining classes will all be live demonstrations where I will actually be securing a website in real time for you guys to see, so you can copy the same process and do that work on your own websites. Now, as I mentioned before, we're going to be learning about why it really matters that you set up these secure websites. We're going to be learning about how they work, what the different important parts are to actually make your website secure. And again, we're learning all this ahead of time just so when we're going through the actual training as far as what exactly needs to be done, so you'll kind of have an understanding of all those concepts as we go through it all. That way you won't end up being lost. Some of this stuff can get a little bit confusing for people that may not be familiar with it ahead of time. So I feel like this is an important aspect to learning this entire process. So with that said, the first thing that I want to cover today is some terminology having to do with these secure websites. The first thing I want to talk about is SSL. And this also kind of ties into something that you will need to be able to make a website secure, and that is an SSL certificate. SSL stands for Secure Sockets Layer. It's not really something that you need to know to be able to accomplish this, but it is important to know that SSL is basically the background technology that is used for the security of these sites. This basically allows for encrypted communications to be taking place between a web browser when somebody tries to access your website and the actual web server. This has kind of been an evolving technology over time, though. And technically, SSL isn't actually used anymore. It's actually TLS these days, something that I will move along to talk about in just a few minutes. But it's still all referred to now as just SSL in general. Now, the SSL certificate is something that we will be going into a lot more detail on in the next class in this series. But basically, an SSL certificate is something that you will either get from your web host. Certain shared web hosts will actually provide these for you for free. And if that's not the case, then this is something that you will have to go out and purchase for your website. But again, we'll be talking about this more in detail in the next class. They're fairly affordable though. There are some places out there that will charge quite a bit of money for them, but it really doesn't matter where you get them from. So you don't have to go for just any source of them. There's no point in buying one that costs, 5-10 times more than another place. It's all still basically the same thing. So the SSL certificate is something, once you have it, you will get this installed on your web server or on your web hosting account. And this is what actually allows for that encrypted communication to be taking place. The SSL certificate has these keys that get generated for them. And these keys are put on your web hosting account. Then when somebody tries to access your website securely, it uses these keys to secure that communication. That way it can double check with these keys and ensure that the information that is being sent between the web browser and the server, to ensure that it hasn't been tampered with, to ensure that it hasn't been altered or intercepted in any way. So this is what allows for that encrypted communication to be taking place. Now, when it comes to actually accessing a site securely, once you have this SSL certificate set up, what really determines whether that is going to be used or not is the website address that somebody uses to access your website. You've probably all seen HTTP and/or HTTPS being used at the very beginning of a website address. Every website on the entire internet utilizes one of these two types of addresses. Some of them can actually be accessed using both. HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol, and HTTPS stands for the same thing but with the word secure on the end of it. So whether or not you are accessing a secure website will ultimately depend on the address that is being used to pull it up. So if you type in HTTP for the beginning of a website address, it will not be secure as far as the connection goes. If you access it using HTTPS, then it will be at least attempted to be accessed on a secure connection. Now, what I mean by attempted here This is something that I will be getting into a little bit more detail in during this class. But basically, just because you have an SSL certificate set up, and just because you're accessing this website using the HTTPS address, does not actually guarantee that the communication between the browser and the server will actually be secure. There are a number of other factors that are tied into that. And this is ultimately where most people go wrong when it comes to setting up their website using this secure SSL technology. And again, I'll get into some more details on this in just a few here. Before I do that though, I want to mention one last piece of terminology, and that is TLS. TLS stands for Transport Layer Security. And again, this is usually these days referred to as SSL simply because SSL is basically the predecessor of TLS. But TLS is pretty much standard these days. But if you still see it being referred to as SSL, just remember that, that ultimately does not really matter. To my knowledge, I don't believe there are any sites that are still technically using the old SSL technology. If you really want to be absolutely sure on that fact, though, especially when perhaps you're purchasing an SSL certificate, which again we'll be covering in the next class, just look at the version that is being associated with the certificate that you're going to be buying. Currently, version 1.2 of TLS is the most current version that is actively in use. They are working on version 1.3 right now as of July 2017. But this is not actually in use on websites yet. It's not being supported by web browsers yet. So TLS version 1.2 is really the most modern version of this security that you can be utilizing for the time being. So without really knowing that type of stuff, it can be a little bit confusing when it actually comes time to purchase your certificate to know whether or not you're getting the right kind or the most current version, things of that nature. Now, I also mentioned just a second ago that I was going to go into some more detail about what actually makes your website secure. The SSL certificate is, of course, the first essential piece to this. Without this, if you try to access your website using the HTTPS address, it will attempt to do so, but without that certificate being there, the web browser that you are using to access the website is going to look at details on that certificate. It's going to make sure that the domain name that that certificate has been issued for actually matches up with your domain name. So this is something that you do have to purchase and set up on each individual website to actually be able to utilize it. It will also include other information such as your name or perhaps a company name, even things like an address and a phone number that gets associated with this. It will even be looking at the expiration date for this certificate. Typically, these certificates are issued on a yearly basis, although you can buy them for multiple years at a time. The cheapest place that I believe I've been able to find them for costs about $16 a year per domain name. However, there are a lot of shared website hosts that will already have one that you can use completely free of charge. And so if that is a possibility, that is something that you can certainly consider doing. And again, I'll go into a lot more detail about this type of stuff in the next lesson. Now, ultimately, without this SSL certificate, none of the other stuff is really going to matter. When your web browser tries to contact the site and to get the details for this certificate, if it's not present, or if it's expired, or if the domain name doesn't match up with the details on that certificate, then ultimately the check for whether or not the connection is secure will just automatically fail outright. So that's why this is the first essential part to having a secure website. It's an absolute must. It has to be installed properly on your web server, but it doesn't matter what kind of web server or web hosting you are using. This is something that you can do on shared web hosting all the way up to having your own dedicated server. With the actual SSL certificate properly installed and set up on your website, then there are a couple of other aspects that determine whether the actual connection between the browser and the server ends up being secure or not. The first part of this involves whether or not somebody is actually typing in that HTTPS address, or whether they are using HTTP to access your site. However, since you don't really have control over what somebody might type in to access your website, and since you might not have control over things like a web link that is on another website that is pointing to your site, there are things that you can do to handle this on your end. And so that's why I consider traffic redirects to be another essential part to actually securing these websites. Basically, by using a traffic redirect, you can ensure that anybody that is trying to access your site is doing so through that secure connection. So this allows you to force the HTTPS address to always be used, no matter who is accessing your site or where they're accessing it from or how they're arriving at your website. Even if there are already links out on the internet, whether it's on other websites or maybe on the Google search engine, if they are already HTTP addresses and not HTTPS, you can force this to change when somebody simply lands on your website. So this is kind of a two-part process, the traffic redirects. Again, I will be going into detail in the future classes to actually teach you how to set up all of this, but it is kind of important to understand up front why this needs to be done, so it's not a step that you end up skipping, and so you can ensure that this is actually being done correctly. Missing any of these pieces that I am talking about here will end up causing your site connection to not be secure. And this is what most people end up missing, is either number 2 or number 3 off of the list that you see on my screen here. And by missing any piece of that, their site connection is then not secure. So this is actually why over 90% of all websites that attempt to set up an SSL certificate, they end up doing so incorrectly. So the two parts to accomplishing one of these traffic redirects. I like to do this in two different ways, or from two different perspectives, I guess you could say, just to ensure that there's no way that people can possibly get around this. One of these is pretty simple. If you're using a content management system such as WordPress, which is what I will be using during this entire series, it's pretty easy to go ahead and configure your site to always be loaded up with the HTTPS address. However, it is still possible to sidestep that. If somebody directly types in the HTTP address for your site, or they follow a web link, they could still technically get through to your site using that unsecure connection. This can also have other ramifications, such as if Google can access your site using both HTTP and HTTPS, it can oftentimes view that as being two separate websites. And this can actually end up harming your search engine rankings as a result, because you'll basically have two pages, two copies of every page on your site that get indexed by Google. One would be using the HTTP address, and the other one would be using HTTPS. So for this reason, to accomplish ensuring that all the traffic is always coming through on this HTTPS address, I like to set up a backend redirect. This is something done through something called an htaccess file. Again, we will be going into details as far as what this is and how this is actually accomplished in the future classes of this series. But for now, I just want you to understand that this htaccess file ensures that even if somebody directly types in HTTP to try to access your website, it's going to recognize that address being typed in, and it's going to automatically redirect people to the HTTPS address, and it will also do so in a way that prevents Google from actually indexing the two of them or thinking that they are separate. This is done by setting up a permanent redirect. So if Google tries to follow an HTTP link to get to your site, it will not only get redirected, but it will be told that this is a permanent redirect, which means that the old one is no longer actually valid, that they shouldn't be indexing that older address. So this ensures that all of the traffic coming through to your site simply goes through this secure connection. Now, the final piece to a secure website involves your website resources. When I say resources here, this term can really mean a wide variety of different things. There are a lot of different parts to a website that when you type in a web address and you go to load up a page on that particular site, it's not only loading up all the text from that site, but in most cases, it will be loading up other things too. This could be JavaScript files, it could be CSS files that control the design of your site, it could be things that are actually embedded within the web page itself, such as images, audio files, videos. And this isn't even a complete list. There are certainly other types of resources that can technically be loaded up on a web page. Now, this is really important to understand because in the vast majority of cases, this is where the whole secure connection thing simply goes wrong. By just missing one single piece on any given page of a website, that particular page will simply be not secure. And if that is happening, then you lose all of the benefits of actually trying to do this in the first place. People in their web browser will see that your site is not secure, even though you might have 99% of everything set up to where it should be secure. It might be being accessed through the correct address, But if just one of these little checks fails, then that all goes out the window. You would also lose the benefit of the increased search engine rankings. Google will not view your site as being secure unless all of these checks actually go through successfully. So what you need to make sure actually gets accomplished on your site is that everything that is being loaded from every single page throughout the entire site has to be loaded through this HTTPS address. Now, that may sound a little daunting at this point in time, but I assure you it's really not that difficult. And this is actually the biggest reason why, once we get to the relevant class in this series, where we're going to be checking and setting up all of these secure website resources, that's why I'm including a plugin as part of this series. And this plugin is going to scan your entire website for you, and it'll be able to directly point out and identify any place throughout your entire website that is not actually secure as it should be. So it's going to be checking all those links, all of the JavaScript files, all the CSS files, the images, the video, the audio, anything that could possibly be loaded up from your site. It will be scanning all of those different connections and making sure that there is indeed nothing that is being loaded up without using that HTTPS address. Now, it is also important to remember that as part of this, we're not necessarily talking about things that are just loaded up from your website itself. When it comes to links that are on your website, that might be the one exception to this particular rule. It is still okay to have, say, a text link on your website that somebody could click on and it would take them to a completely different website, and that website is not secure. That's actually okay to do. That doesn't make your website become unsecure simply because you're linking up to an unsecured website. So what I'm really referring to here is that any clickable links to your own website, they should be using this HTTPS address. Even though your traffic redirects could technically be taking care of that, it's a lot easier and slightly faster if all of your traffic is just pointed to an HTTPS address from the get-go. But the really important part of all this is making sure that all of those other resources are accessed securely. And this can sometimes present a bit of a problem when it comes to using something like WordPress, because you don't always have direct control over everything that is being loaded up. For example, a lot of WordPress plugins might be utilizing a JavaScript file, might be using a CSS file to try to control the design of some of your public web pages. And if for any reason those addresses, if they have been hard-coded into the plugin as an HTTP address, then that can cause this entire secure website system to end up failing. Again, this is something that my plugin will be able to point out and identify for you, but there's really no guarantee that every single plugin and theme that you are using currently on a website, or that you may be using in the future, there's really no guarantee that they have properly coded them to where this won't become an issue for you. But you'll at least be able to know when this type of thing is occurring on your site. So you can choose whether or not it's more important for you to have your site secure, or whether it's more important for you to be able to utilize a particular plugin that unfortunately would not be loading up secure resources. Beyond the stuff that's out of your control like that, though, anytime you do something as simple as display an image on a web page of yours, whether or not that image is on your website itself, it could be an image that you just found somewhere else on the internet, and maybe you didn't download the image and upload it to your own website. Maybe you're just linking up to that image so it gets displayed on your site, but it's actually being hosted on another website. If that address that is accessing that image is not an HTTPS address, this again can cause that entire web page to be flagged as being not secure. When you have all of these pieces working together properly to where everybody is accessing your site using the secure address, to where everything that that site is trying to load up is being loaded securely, and when you also have a valid SSL certificate, all these things need to come together in order for the web browser to actually say that yes, indeed, this site connection is actually secure. And the same thing needs to be taking place in order for Google to be able to look at your site to say, yes, this site is actually being loaded up securely. Otherwise, it will just simply get flagged as not being secure, almost as though you had never even attempted to do any of this stuff to your site. And again, this is usually where people end up going wrong with this entire process. Now, ultimately, there are, in my eyes at least, three main reasons why it's important to have a secure website. If you don't have a secure website, it's not going to cause your site to just be guaranteed to be not successful or anything like that. You can still run unsecure websites and have them be plenty successful. But as things change in the industry, as people that are visiting websites start to understand these concepts better, your results will simply decline over time without actually utilizing this. With that said, though, like I mentioned, it's not a guarantee that if you don't do this, that your website is just doomed to fail. I have plenty of websites that are not currently running on a secure connection, and they still do just fine. But a lot of these sites are older websites. They're well established. They already have really great Google rankings. And it doesn't still mean, though, that those rankings will decline over time, because Google does seem to actively be ramping up their importance level that they place on a site actually being secure. So it's entirely possible, a couple years down the road, that sites of mine, if I leave them unsecured during that whole time, that they may end up declining from the Google rankings. They may end up disappearing entirely, or they might just simply drop out of the top 10 rankings and start receiving less traffic than they ordinarily would have been able to receive. Now, ultimately, there are a lot of different reasons why, traditionally at least, why a site would want to be using one of these secure connections. And this is also a big reason for why a lot of my sites do not actually use these secure connections is because the way it was traditionally used, if you only had a purely content-based website where, like an Amazon affiliate site, for example, there may not have been much of a benefit to having that site secure. Ultimately, if a site doesn't require somebody to log in to a members area on the site, if they're not trying to sell anything on the website, and by selling anything on the site, I'm talking about the entire purchase process, to where I'm sure you've gone to an e-commerce site before, Amazon, for example, where the entire purchase process is actually taking place on their website. You're entering in your personal information, credit card information on that website. This is what I really mean by completing a purchase on that site. If you just have a PayPal button on your website, or something like what I do on a lot of my websites, a JVZoo payment button, those purchases, even though they're originating on a site that is not secure, the actual purchase itself, the place where all of that personal or sensitive information is being entered, all of that is taking place on another website. And the other website, the JVZoo website, the PayPal website, those are secure. So all of that personal information is being protected in those cases. There's no way that people can intercept that type of information. So hopefully this emphasizes the difference between completing a purchase on a website and a purchase simply originating on a website. So if you don't have to log in on your website, if you don't have to have a purchase completed solely on your website itself, or require people to enter in any kind of personal information on your website, traditionally there was not really a big need for having your site to be secure. Nowadays, though, that is definitely starting to change for a couple of different reasons, though. The first biggest reason, though, is the way that Google has started to interpret these secure websites. Even Google still has properties, still has domain names that are not running on a secure connection. It's not very many of them anymore. I can't remember recently what their percentage was up to. It's in the 90% range, though, of the number of their properties that are running on a secure connection. But there are still some that are not utilizing it. But their goal is to eventually transition 100% of all their properties, all their different domain names and subdomains that they use, to being on these secure connections. Because Google is starting to realize the importance of this for a variety of different reasons, they have begun to impose more of an importance on whether your site can be connected to securely when it comes to their search engine rankings. So they have made this a part of their ranking algorithm nowadays, where if everything between two different websites is exactly the same in terms of what would ordinarily affect how they are placed in the Google search rankings. If one of those sites uses a secure connection and one of them does not, the site with the secure connection will end up having a higher ranking than the non-secure site will. So by simply setting up your website using one of these secure connections, you are able to increase your search rankings for that site. Now, this is actually something that they started doing, I believe, back in 2014. They made this a part of their algorithm. But just this year, in 2017, they have started to make this even more important, and they are increasing the amount of power that this gives to your website. And this is very, very evident when you dive into various types of data and reports and research that has been done on Google and on their search engine rankings, where you can see steadily over time that the number of websites, the percentage of websites that are, say, showing up in the top 10 of Google rankings across all different search terms, there is a steady increase in the percentage of these sites that are using this secure connection. Just in the last couple of months, it's gone up a couple of percents. So fast forward another year or two, and there's a very strong likelihood that an overwhelming number of the websites in the top 10 of Google search rankings for any given keyword phrase, that they will be using this secure connection. So now I really feel like is the most important time to latch on to this concept and to start utilizing it on any website that you would like to be able to get good Google rankings for, to be able to get free search traffic from. So because of all this, this means that even purely content-based websites now, such as an Amazon site that doesn't require entering in any kind of personal information on it whatsoever, can still benefit from using SSL, can still benefit from having these secure connections. Even though there's technically not any information being passed back and forth between the web browser and the server that would have a real need to be secured, it's still going to benefit you when it comes to Google search rankings. Now, another aspect of why this is important to do involves your web browser. And this is something that you can see for yourself by pulling up any web browser that you might have installed on your computer and trying to access a site using an HTTP address and then trying to access a site using an HTTPS address. When you're accessing a site securely, there's a little padlock, with most browsers at least, that will blatantly tell you that yes, your connection is secure, or no, your connection is not secure. So over the course of time, normal website visitors are getting accustomed to this. And there is a growing percentage of website visitors that if they land on your site and see that it is not using a secure connection, whether it matters or not that the connection is secure, whether there's actually going to be personal information being exchanged, some people will still just avoid websites that are not using these secure connections. And again, the web browsers will blatantly identify these. So people are starting to get used to this. And this is also very evident in reports and research that has been taking place on the internet over the years, where they're actually tracking the people that find this important, the people that will immediately leave a website simply because it's not secure. And it is a growing trend. 5-10 years ago, a lot of people really didn't care or even realize this type of thing. But because web browsers are now making this more obvious that a connection is not secure, and people are becoming more aware of things such as identity theft or other, poor tactics that are being utilized on the internet to try to steal people's information, it just kind of plays on paranoia factor in some people's minds. So if they see that the connection is not secure, they may just simply decide to leave and look for another website that is secure. Now, this also kind of ties into the next point of visitor trust. When people can see that your site is secure, being indicated to them through the web browser, it makes them simply more trusting in your website in general. And this even applies for strictly content-based websites. Even though it doesn't matter whether that connection is secure or not, it's just kind of becoming a bit of a comfort zone for some people, where they want to see that this site connection is indeed secure before they actually spend some time on it, do browsing around, or do pretty much anything on the website. However, if you happen to be running a kind of site that is not a content-based website, if it requires putting in any kind of personal information, even something as simple as a name and an email address, where they might be submitting a contact form, that's still personal information that is being submitted and transmitted from the web browser to the server. And it is technically possible for hackers to be able to intercept that information. So if your site is asking for pretty much anything as far as personal information, if you're trying to get people to complete a purchase directly on your website to where the entire purchase process is taking place on your site, or to where they even have to enter in any kind of personal information on your website itself before they're taken off to another website. If they have to log into a members area on your website, it's extremely important to have one of these secure connections, or you will definitely end up losing some of your traffic as a result. This is the most obvious and the most drastic effect when it comes to running something like an e-commerce site, where the entire purchase process takes place on your website itself. You can lose sometimes 50% or even more of your potential customers by simply ignoring all of this stuff, by having a site that is not on a secure connection. With other types of sites, it is not that drastic of an effect, but again, it's still there. It's still taking place. So pretty much no matter what kind of site you're running, I highly recommend to try to get all them set up running on a secure connection. But if, like me, for example, if you have 100 different websites that you're running, being able to get all of them set up on a secure connection immediately is just not really possible to do. So in these cases, you would certainly want to kind of pick and choose which ones are the most important. Which ones is there actually a need for this secure connection to be taking place? You start with those, and then you work your way through to the least important ones, ending with your content-based websites, the ones where there is no personal information being exchanged. But if you're only running a couple of sites, maybe you're only running one website and it's purely content-based, there's not really a need to put that on the back burner. You can just go ahead and take care of those outright and simply get them running on a secure connection as quick as you possibly can. Now, I want to talk about the two most common mistakes that can be made when you are trying to set up these secure connections, when you're trying to set up SSL to run on your site. Now, this is kind of already stuff that I have mentioned to a certain extent already in this particular class, but it's really, really important that I reemphasize these concepts, because these are the things that for the vast majority of people that end up attempting to set up a secure site, these are the things that they end up failing at, or at least some part of this. As I mentioned earlier, all it takes is missing one tiny little piece, and all of your efforts kind of go to waste. So it's really important that you don't miss any of these pieces, that you're very aware of what is actually making a site secure. So that way, once you are doing this yourself on your own website, you can not just do the work to set up an SSL certificate and to set up the site as being secure, but you can actually know for sure, you can go and verify it yourself that yes, your site, all the pages on your site are indeed on a secure connection. So the first one here is not redirecting your HTTP traffic. As I mentioned earlier, it is quite possible to have your site set up, to have the SSL certificate set up on your website, to have everything else configured correctly to run on a secure connection, but all it takes is somebody manually typing in the HTTP address at the beginning of your domain name, and your site is loaded and it's not going through this secure connection. This can happen when somebody types in the address directly. It can happen when people follow a link from another website to your website. It can even happen if somebody is just clicking on a search engine listing from Google, for example. This is especially the case if you already have these sites running right now using a standard unsecure connection, and then you go and you try to set up this secure connection on it. Pretty much any traffic that you have coming into that website, when you make that switch, that traffic is likely going to be accessing the site incorrectly using that HTTP address. Now, there are a number of ways that you can kind of find the source of that traffic and to change it. For example, in the Google Search Console, in Google Analytics even, you can configure how your site is being accessed, how your site would end up being indexed, especially in the Google Search Console. So you can specify whether your site should be on HTTP or HTTPS. You can also go out there in some cases and update old links that you might have on the internet. If you're running a Facebook fan page for your website and there's a link on there pointing to your site, links like that, you can certainly go and update. But there are a lot of other potential sources for website links that might be completely impossible to update. If somebody that runs another website just decides to link up to your site, it'd be pretty hard to track down all those, to contact all the website owners, and to actually get every single one of them to manually update the address that is being used in your link. Plus, there's really no way, even if you could cover all those other things and get everything that's out there updated, you can't really stop everybody from just typing in the address themselves. So, to overcome all these potential problems, you just simply need to make sure that you have traffic redirects in place that will prevent people from being able to access your site using the HTTP address. You need everybody to be coming through HTTPS. Again, this is something that we will be able to accomplish using settings that are within WordPress, also using the htaccess file that I referred to a little while ago. But you need to be aware of this, because when you actually go through and do this work on your website, try it for yourself. Try to access your site using HTTP. Once you have all of these things set up and in place and see if it's possible to get to your site with an unsecured connection. If it is, it's an immediate indication to you that something was not set up or configured correctly. Maybe you missed a step along the way. Try this not only on the home page of your website, but try to find other pages on your site. You don't have to do every single page on your site necessarily, but try something other than the home page. If you have different directories on your site, folders where there might be other files, if you have subdomains on your website, try all of those different combinations. Basically, try one different web page from each of the different kinds of website addresses that you could potentially have on your website. This will help to make sure that there's no possible way that people can get through using this unsecured connection. Now, the other most common problem is having the website resources being unsecured. This can be a variety of different things. It can be simply showing an image on your website and referencing it using the HTTP address. Whether this image takes place or is located on your website or not, if the image is being displayed on your web page, it must be accessed using HTTPS. And if it's not, then your site will simply not be secure. At least that web page on your website will not be secure. I also mentioned earlier that there can be some more complicated situations where this type of thing may arise. Things like a JavaScript file or a CSS file. There are definitely some WordPress plugins that not only use JavaScript or CSS files, but they might not be built into the actual plugin itself. Google, for example, has a repository of JavaScript files that are very commonly accessed by websites. And at least as of earlier this year, it was not possible to access those using a secure address. So the only way that you could actually utilize those resources on your website securely was to go and download those files yourself, to then upload them to your website, and then to change the references on your site to point to your site using that secure connection instead. However, if the other website that you're loading something from, if it can be accessed securely, all you really have to do is change that address. You don't have to have everything hosted on your actual site, but anything that your site is trying to load must be loaded securely, or this whole process will simply end up failing. And then, even though everything else is set up correct, when you go and try to access your web page in a browser, it will say that your connection is not secure. This can definitely be very frustrating for people that are not aware of this fact. And this, again, is why most people that end up attempting this sort of thing, they usually end up failing at it. Over 90% of sites that try this will get something wrong having to do with it. And in the vast majority of those cases, it's something as simple as using an unsecured website resource. Loading up an image on your page, loading up a JavaScript file on your page that is not secure. And it can be pretty hard to track down, especially if you're not really even aware that this has to be done. So, knowing that this must be done when you are going through the trouble of setting up your site using SSL, is the first part of it. The plugin that I will end up providing you guys with when we come to the relevant part of this training series will help to set your mind at ease as far as ensuring whether or not you have everything loaded up correctly, because it will be able to identify specific pages of your site that are loading even one tiny little thing and it not being a secured resource. And as I mentioned before, just one little thing going wrong causes all of the work to essentially be wasted, at least until corrections can be made to your site to where everything is being loaded 100% securely that your web page is trying to load up and display to people on their web browser. Now, this does not have to be taking place on the backend pages of your site. For example, if you're running a WordPress website, the administration area of your site, you're not going to be penalized by Google, for example, if one of the administration pages of your site is not being loaded up securely, simply because Google's not going to be accessing those pages. Your website visitors are not going to be accessing those pages. So basically, whatever Google can get to, whatever normal website visitors of yours can get to, these are the pages that you need to have set up 100% securely. You need to make sure it's not possible for people to access them using HTTP. You need to make sure that all of the resources that those pages are trying to load are being loaded securely. So I wanted to make sure to emphasize that point to you. It doesn't necessarily have to be 100% of your entire website. It mainly needs to be the pages that you expect for the public to be able to access. Now, with that said though, it's still important that other pages on your site, administration pages of your site, if you are going through the trouble of setting up an SSL certificate and having the whole site being secured, it will definitely benefit you to have those back-end pages being secured. But not all of the pages of your website are going to be directly accessible as far as the WordPress dashboard pages. The login page of your WordPress site, where you would personally go to enter in your admin name and your admin password, a page like that, you certainly want to be secure so people can't intercept your login information to that site. But everything else that's in that dashboard area, all the other backend pages, you can really only get to those pages once you have gotten through that login gateway. So it's really more those other pages that are not part of that login gateway where the importance of having all of those secured becomes drastically lowered. So your login pages, and then any other page that you would expect for the public to be able to reach. Those are the most important ones that you really need to be focusing on. Once you can cover all that stuff, then you know that your site is secure. You will get all the benefits from having a secure website. Visitors to your site will know that your site is secure, and you will have that increased trust factor from them as well because of it. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in beginning with the next class in this series and continuing for the rest of this series, all three of the remaining classes of this series. We will actually be diving into a live demonstration of me walking you through all of the parts to this entire process from start to finish on a website of my own, where I will start with getting the SSL certificate. Technically, I will have to do that part a little bit ahead of time because it's not, in most cases, something that can instantly go through. But I will certainly be showing you guys where to do all this and how to get it done so you can get a certificate of your own. I'll be walking you guys through getting this installed and set up on your site. My goal is to demonstrate this on both a shared web hosting account type of environment and also on a dedicated web server, just in case, you know, some of you out there may be using one or the other. I personally have both a dedicated server and also shared hosting accounts. And I know that the vast majority of people running websites will be using a shared web hosting account. But the process of installing an SSL certificate is actually vastly different in those two environments. You have to do completely different things. With a shared web host account, in a lot of cases, you can get the web host to do a good chunk of it, if not all of it, for you. Whereas on a dedicated server, you're pretty much left to figure it all out on your own, and it can be pretty complicated and a daunting task for people that are just trying to figure it out on their own. Even for somebody like me that is very technically inclined, that has been using and running websites for over 20 years now. The first time I tried to install an SSL certificate on my own dedicated server, I was absolutely lost and clueless about what I was supposed to be doing, how it should be done. Even once I had it set up, I still didn't really know for sure whether I had done it correctly or not. Obviously, this was a while ago, and I've since overcome these things, but without having anybody to actually show you this stuff, even if you're, very technically inclined like I am, it can still be a rather confusing process. So I wanted to make sure to walk you guys through all of this stuff from the very beginning. Then we'll proceed on with configuring our site, setting up our redirects. Then we'll be proceeding on with setting up all of our resources, making sure these are all accessed securely, talking about different strategies that can help to accomplish this without having to basically do a lot of mind-numbing work, searching through links individually, things of that nature. So with that said, I would like to go ahead and open the floor to open Q&A. If you have any questions having to do with today's class, anything I've been discussing so far, please feel free to ask them in the chat box at any time. I do understand, though, that at least for this first particular class, without actually seeing anything getting done, there may be a limited number of questions to go around for this class, which is quite all right. We will be diving into everything in a lot more detail with all hands-on examples and real-time demonstrations in the future classes to where all of these concepts become a lot clearer. But I still couldn't fathom running this particular series without this first class here, just trying to teach all of the basics of this process, because without it, the later stuff becomes a lot more confusing. You start to wonder, whether this is a step that you could skip or whether it really mattered if you did this, how it would affect you if something wasn't done correctly or not. So even though we didn't get into actual hands-on demonstrations today, I think you will see as we progress through this series that this particular class was very necessary to have as a part of the whole training program.